Marion Muliaumaseali'I. Apologies for any mispronunciation, Marion. Marion, great segue into mobile communication in Samoa and its diaspora. Marion looks at indigenography and design, and we're looking at mediating the. Over to you, Marion.
Thank you so much. First of all, just want to acknowledge that Māori are the indigenous people of New Zealand. I want to acknowledge our brothers and sisters across the ditch, where Australia, the lands were never ceded, and that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Just whaatalofa atu le paia ma le mamalu wa awhia, whaftai lava, tai whono, Henry, Mavalia, me se lava o ta uma ta pua le nei afi. So I'm just gonna go live, Valia. As you can probably, I think I was umming and ahhing, and there's nothing quite like the thrill of possibly messing up live. And I'm also going to time myself. So I've got my little timer here. And so just to share that I'm actually, this is a topic that I'm still working on. So it's a working title. My research in Samoa was around looking at the mobile phones and the VAR, and does mobile communication change the VAR or affect it? And I was really looking at the practices of Samoans in a traditional Samoan village in rural Samoa. Some could argue it's not as rural as Savaii. It was in Upolu, which is the main island. And so there are a lot more access to things like there's transport, there's more access to food, there's more modern things in Vaiala, sorry, in Vaiala, that's my village, in Upolu, rather than Savaii. But I was in a coastal village where you'd have, like, in the district, like 4,500 people, villages probably between 500 to 700 people, and I was there for 7 to 8 months. So I was really looking at the practices in Samoa, in the village. And when I had a conversation with Valia around, so how do they communicate with its diaspora in New Zealand or Australia? So I'm kind of sitting on the fence of where the direction of this is going to go. So it's a good practice for me. And I really wanted to focus on, the mobile phone. So, and its intangible properties and how it can relate to the VAR. So when we think about the presentation today, just want to, this is the outline. What is the purpose of this investigation? What are we really discussing? Is it telephonic conversations or more? Obviously, if you've done a PhD, then it's more. It's always more. We're going to break down the space in between, or the VAR. So I looked at what I called the principles of VAR: the VAR tapuia, the VAR fe'alualua'i, and the relational space, or the nurturing the space till le VAR. At the moment, as I'm writing this, I'm playing around with, when you look at till the VAR, usually it's about bridging a breach in the VAR, an offence, but there's also Dulce the VAR, nurturing that space. So I'll hold that loosely. Then we'll look at the mediated spaces. Basically it's the transition of information communication, the unseen space, which is noted as presence, social presence, and co-presence. From there, we're looking at, some stories. Again, in terms of looking at what were the conversations I had with my participants of the experience away from home. There's a few, but there's obviously more of the practices in the village. So as I'm investigating, I'm going back to a lot of my writings that didn't make the cut. So there's a lot more investigation into that, but there's definitely conversations that we could have today. And then I wanted to talk about why I'm passionate about the work that I'm doing and how the in-between informs my practice and what I'm doing now. So let's start with the abstract, right? So that has a lot of improvement, and it's, you know, when we say, how does a mobile phone deal with the VAR? When I actually want to position the VAR as the premise of my conversation, and the mobile phone as the enabler. So what happens when you're using a mobile phone to connect, to nurture the space in between, to connect you with your family abroad, create community and nurture relationships. So, you know, we're looking at how I describe mediated spaces as the intangible property of the mobile phone, making a distinct connection with intangible properties of VAR. I say intangible properties of VAR because in my research, I talked about tangible properties of VAR, and it's that space where you have to kind of understand that if you're with a chief and you've got your shorts on in the village, you need to go and put on sort of an lava. If you have a singlet on, you've got to cover your shoulders. So that's a tangible evidence that you are honoring the VAR between yourself and the high chief. So just a quick example why I say intangible. It could be obvious too as we talk through this. And also to recognize that I think we talked about, I mean, I mentioned before, building on Yuki's idea of reverse migration. I talked about my experience as reverse ethnography. As an ethnographer, you're the outsider looking in, but I arrived and I'm Samoan. You know, I was not allowed to speak English growing up. It's a bit rusty, but I can definitely hold a conversation. I definitely did my research. So I felt I'm Samoan enough. But we talk about reverse migration, and in my reverse ethnography, maybe I was not Samoan enough. And so all those different tensions in the VAR and trying to navigate myself around the village of how do I get conversations and get trust with my community. So, you know, arriving at the village and trying to understand that, you know, I think also the institutionalized training as a academic and as a researcher, how do you ask about media in a village that in the 70s only had one landline, in a village where you share a mobile phone between two houses, in a village where they may not have enough money to buy data, and so there's a low uptake of mobile phones. And it brings me to the point of Don Slater talks about communicative assemblages, and I think it's that mindset of Western researchers that arrive at these developing nations or the Pacific, and they ask the questions as if you were still in a Western context. So village Samoa communication is mediated through communicative assemblages that involve people, technology, transport, roads, written messages, bells, mobile phones that are used as means to communicate messages. The mobile phone enters a communicative ecology that engages stable or routinized systems for accomplishing communication, and as in other developing contexts, creates its own meaning and usage. So if you see this pathway, this road, to the naked eye, to those that are unknowing, that do not understand VAR or that we are people of the ocean, that looks like a normal road. But if you walk that road towards the shop, because you understand that in VAR and in making sure that your relationship with those around you, you are respectful. If a chief or an elderly person or anyone really stops and says, "Where are you going?" and you say, "Oh, I'm just going to buy some supplies because we're expecting some visitors." "Who are your visitors?" "Oh, we got some friends coming from New Zealand family." "Oh, that's nice. And how long are they staying for?" And so because you may be outranked, or maybe you just understand that this person's not being nosy. They're just, well, maybe they are, but they're actually trying to find out more information. And so this walk to the dairy or to the shop becomes a form of communication. It's almost like the coconut wireless. So you go on your way and you go to the shop, and by the time you get there, 9 times out of 10, the dairy or the shop owner will go, "Oh, I hear you've got some visitors coming." How did they know that? Maybe the mobile phone was used, but usually in this context, the person that was asking the questions, the matai or the elder, usually would call the girl and go, hey, I think you should start making some swesi. We got some visitors coming to the village for Marion and her friends. And then they go, oh, what happens there? So everyone gets to know what's happening. Would you call that media? Would a Samoan person tell someone doing research that that's how we communicate? Perhaps the questions they're asking are incorrect. And I think that's the main point I really want to push through as I'm continuing to build the notion of the mobile phone as an enabler for the wā, to nurture the wā, to tausi wā. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes and passages from E Piliho off a Sea of Islands, where again, it's about perspective. There's a world of difference between viewing the Pacific as islands in a far sea and as a sea of islands. The first emphasizes dry surfaces and a vast ocean far from the centers of power. Focusing in this way stresses the smallness and remoteness of the islands. The second is a more holistic perspective in which things are seen in the totality of their relationship. And I think that researchers who do not understand the context of Pacific people, of people of Oceania, they kind of view this pathway, so I was trying to go back, as as something in a far dry sea. It's just an open road with nothing. There's nothing you can really learn from that. But for us, people of the ocean who understand wā, it's more than that. And kind of leaning towards that in terms of what that means for a Samoan in diaspora, connecting with their family in the village and how they think about mobile communication. So let's just talk, sorry. Yeah, so let's just remind ourselves of, the village back in the day. So one of the stories was like in the 70s, there was only one village that belonged to the high chief, and every time someone wanted to call, every whole village knew. So you might get a call at midnight or 11 p.m. And because it was so quiet, in the villages where there's, especially when the SAR is on the curfew, you can hear everything. You can hear a pin drop from the other side of the village. And so at nighttime, when the stars out, you can see all the stars and it's quiet. When it rings, the whole village will go, oh, someone's calling. Someone's calling. I wonder what it is, a wha'alawe. So it was the only way that you could, send a message, or usually because it was expensive to call Samoa, people knew it would be a short call, and they could tell by the time of the phone call whether it was someone that passed, someone needed money. And the main complaint was that there was no privacy. It was just like answer the phone, get the message. And also when the phone call is received, the person that owns the phone would have to send someone, tell them to get someone. So they've got someone calling from America, New Zealand, wherever the case may be. Again, it became everyone's business and everyone knew about it. But that's village life. The other story was the second phone was set up at the shop, and it cost you a tāla per call. So if you wanted to make a call, it cost you 1 tāla, but if you received the call, it cost you 50 cents. And again, it was just, it was no privacy. You get the phone, you show up, and they'll be asking who you're calling, because they will write it down. How long is it going to be? They ask what's the phone call for. And my participants once said, I don't know why they ask me what it's for, it's none of their business, but I feel I have to tell them. So because of the lack of privacy, transactional conversations, they become transactional rather than relational due to the lack of privacy. So when the mobile phone, when people started to get the mobile phone, there were just 3 key points of change, and that was the fact that Len calls it individual addressability, the accessibility of a person to person. And it was a sense of freedom that you didn't have to go to the store, you didn't have to wait for someone, get permission to call someone or pay for that it was, direct. It was direct. So that was the, I guess, the appeal of having a mobile phone. also knowing that it was very expensive. The other thing was that, sorry, I just mentioned the budget. People started to save, people started to have data on their phone or start to put on their shopping list, buy data, buy some credit. Also people started to appropriate different ways of using the phone. So if you didn't have a phone, if you didn't have any credit, you just call once and don't answer and hang up straight away. And then the person who received the call would know that you need them to call them back. So with all this China, using the mobile phone in different ways. And because they had like the ability to have a private conversation, it became a lot more relational rather than the contrast of the transactional. So what does this have to do with the space in between? Sorry, can I have a time check? My timer stopped. Can I have a time check? Can't hear.
So you got 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'm gonna rush through this. So when we look at the space in between, when I read this, it just makes me feel like, it's just, again, the intangible to tangible properties. And when we think about how the mobile phone translate or enables this relational va, it makes it a lot clear when we're looking at the va tapu ia. What I like about the va tapu ia for me was that it talks about that the space between man and all things living and dead. It implies that our relations with all things exists in sacred essence, a force beyond human reckoning. In the Samoan indigenous religion, all matter, whether human, water, animal, plant, and the biosphere are issues of tangaloilelangi. They are divine creations connected by genealogy, reminding us that as Samoans, that we believe that we came from Samoa, that tangaloilelangi is our God. And so when we connect to the va tapu ia, where we, for instance, when someone has passed on and what we could be talking about them, and then a gust of wind blows or the bird flies, often the elder people go, oh, look, they're checking in on us. The connection of va tapu ia. Va whiaaloaloa'i, the relational space between all relationships that encourages unity and harmony, like values is nurtured within ainga and nu'u in the family. I think it's the understanding that no matter where your place in the family, that you must be aware of the relational space, no matter how old you are. If you're asked to do something, your parents, you can't say, I'm 35 now, I don't do that, I'm 45. It's the understanding that, and culturally, that you would deal with the value and nurture that space. And there's many other examples I'm going to rush through. So I think with when we talk about nurturing the relationships in the va, when we talk about the mobile phone, it's the connection. As I say, I hold this loosely because I'm also looking at va to nurture and to ensure that relationship is strong, to ensure that we are checking in. And so I want to go through the mobile phone and the mediated spaces, and what does that look like? We know that mediated spaces, it's I call it the intangible properties of the mobile phone. And once we establish that, when people talk about the mobile phone and how the mobile phone allows these relationships to occur, or I say the mobile phone enables what was already existent, the va. When these academics look at all these presence and their social co-presence, and I look at that and I just see va. I just see the mobile phone as something that I guess the first world has caught up to people of Oceania, understanding of the intangible, that the mobile phone through its tangibleness has allowed us communication through technology, that we can have presence, which is a subjective experience of being in one place or environment, even when one is physically situated in another. Kaili talks about social spaces where we connected through genealogy, reminding again of va tapu ia when we say, this is where you're from, this is, and that you can't see it, but you know that it is there. There is that intangible understanding of presence, even with things that are dead. And so there are other examples of our social presence. So Social presence compares how humans interact with different communication media and how they compare media with one another. Perhaps Philip Cass's work around looking at how people are looking at Facebook or the different apps. It occurs when technology users do not notice the para-authenticity of mediated humans or artificially simulated non-human social actors, which we do right now. Sometimes you forget you're on Zoom until you have to unmute yourself. So we're creating social presence. But co-presence is like being in a virtual world with others, the sharing of space with other humans, or the subjective experience of being in one place environment, even when one is physically situated in another. This can be achieved face-to-face, which is otherwise known as offline co-presence. And I pull this out to recognize that, for instance, we're sitting here having this conversation, but you could be also talking to someone who's walking past. You do that on your phone all the time. You're in a place where online you feel like I'm talking to so-and-so who's in America, but I'm also doing my washing. So that the hybrid, there's two different types of communications. And so when we think about our families and us in diaspora trying to connect with our families in Samoa, it's more than just checking in. It's more than just transferring of money. It's about nurturing the va. It's about understanding that, I just talked about that, understanding that through our intangible connection through va, through genealogy, through our connections through the land, we know that our connection to one another, Samoans, is not necessarily just through bloodlines, but it's cultural lands and our titles. So the mobile phone's ability to create immediate co-presence, immediate ability to connect with other people and still do the village things is identified as being a great advantage, because they were able to text family abroad and in other villages while continuing with their daily duties or having face-to-face conversations with friends or family. This notion of hybrid communication allows for conversations to occur at any time and in any location. And also the benefit of not having to fly to somewhere to meet somebody. You can do this on your mobile phone. Obviously you have to with COVID. So I feel like wanted to share, like, in terms of when I think about va and the work that I'm doing now, again, when we say, like, how does a mobile phone nurture the va, or how does a mobile phone, it's like, it's the conduit, right? And the value of the co-presence and social presence, however the first world may look at that, is actually an ancient understanding and ways of being of va. And when I am involved in work in social justice recently, it's trying to understand, how do we understand Pacific people? How do we ensure that the solutions are really relevant to Pacific people? I think COVID is also, the way that government's trying to mitigate risk around COVID is a great example, and the misunderstanding or the mistrust of putting the solutions in the hands of the people that are facing that. And so I think in terms of when I look at the work that I'm doing, Indigenography and Design is something I founded so that I can consult on projects. I found myself in design thinking space where we look at maps, journey maps, and try to understand a human-centered design. When I think about human-centered design, I think about Pacific people, I think about va, I think about our ways of being and the misunderstanding of what that could be, because in a system that is set up for us to fail, for people of color, Pacific people, it's a system that doesn't acknowledge va, it's a system that doesn't acknowledge this transition of the human things that are living, that are dead. I think also it premises things like the mobile phone as the reason why we can communicate really well. Whereas for Pacific people, we were doing that before even the mobile phones. So I think just as I'm flicking through, this was the some of the work we did in the Victoria Youth Justice, well, a village response plan. A young boy was killed. And so we rallied together, we put a village response plan together that is currently now in play for Victoria Youth Justice. Leveraging off that was a reintegration pathway for our Pasifika and Māori youth offenders in Victoria, all about understanding VAR. These conversations with these, we had 6 participants, but because my approach was to gilda VAR, my approach was to gosi VAR, was to try and understand their story. They're all a lot more open, but also trying to work out what their story and how it fits in the systems, which is why there's so much writing. And so that's been circulated across the government in Victoria. This is the other thing around gilda VAR between intersectionality. Again, how is it that we can ensure that those who are marginalized, that their voice is heard, and not through the lens of First World, not through the lens of what is like for instance, communicative assemblages, asking the right questions, is where I use the space in between for the work that I want to do. So I'm Dr. Marion Muliaumaseali'I. I am available for conversations about VAR, about technology, and transversing the interface between Western thinking and Pacifica ideologies. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I learned so much about VAR, and VAR as a Pacific notion, a notion that comes out of a sea of islands and as a paradigm for understanding the geographical context in which we live. Applying that to mobile technology is a fascinating paradigm. The space in between, I think many Western theorists in cultural studies could learn a lot from studying VAR. So, any questions? Yep, Daisy.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. No, I just wanted to say thank you, Marion, for that very, very insightful presentation on Samoan, I suppose, Samoan society, and also with the use of mobile as a means of communication. But also, I felt your discussion of the different forms of VAR, really were highlighted in your presentation. But I wanted to share a story as well with something that resonated with me in your discussion, in terms of how there was one, in the 1970s, you mentioned there was one phone in the village. I remember also my story similar, and in and amongst my village, but we had a phone at home. And so often I have relatives who lived overseas at the time. And when they would ring their family members, who were my neighbors, they'll call, I'll answer. And then they'll tell me to please go fetch, or tell their family member to come and wait for their call back. And so I did that willingly, because I knew that in return, that they would send me something like a goodie, like also. And so, yeah, I was just reminded of that story, because I knew that I'd get something in return if I was to go and send the message for the family member to come and wait for that phone call from their family member who was away. But also just related to a lot of what you talked about, Marion, and yeah, well done, Malula.
Yuki.
Thank you, Marion, for your presentation. I just have a comment. There's a joke among Samoans that sometimes we don't need social media because Samoans are just such gossipers that, they're kind of like, Samoan Twitter. You just say something to one person and it just spreads very quickly, like Twitter. So we call it, the Samoan Twitter without using technology. So that's one thing. The second thing is with regards to your conversation about VAR. There's also, like the VAR Whilawa'i, which is the relationship between people and nature. And the reason why I raised the idea of nature is because mobile phones, together with other imported goods into a small island, often impacts the environment, because in a developing country like Samoa that doesn't have a proper processing recycling plants, it actually impacts the environment. So you have Samoan Stationery and Books, Vodafone, and even Blue Sky, providing service. So once you damage your phone, make sure that you bring it back, so we can recycle it, which is great, but it is still impacts the global South, because the actual physical product cannot be at the end of the day, it gets recycled, but other parts that cannot be recycled actually gets dumped onto the global South community. And you see that in the case of Africa, where there's a parts of the phone where there's specific mineral that comes from the Congo, that activates the phone, right? But at the same time, and it services the world. But all the secondhand goods technology actually comes back to the global South. So I just wondered, when you say that, the mobile is a conduit for communication, that's great. But I wonder what you thought about the environmental impact of a mobile phone.
Marion, you're going to have to be very quick on your answer because we're going to move on.
Yes, thank you, Yuki. And definitely a problem that is, as you say, in Africa, there's that saying around the ICTs, is a graveyard of ICTs, and that's exactly the debris left over. And I think it's that thinking again around technology as the silver bullet for specific issues, when really they don't think about the holistic and understanding of that. And I'm with you in terms of, I think with you, when you talk about the VAR, there's different types of VAR. Again, us as academics, and this is for me, is the challenge, is to keep writing a leverage of current knowledge. And so there's other types of VAR, which is why I'm saying I'm holding loosely on Tole VAR, because that is described by Tuatua as the VAR tapu ia, right? It is that conversation, is the VAR between the land, the nature, which is why I loved about us being connected to the land. And so if we're connected to the land, if you're saying that people are going to come as a part of you and they're actually dumping toxic waste on your own body, you don't want that. So what I love about when you talk more about the VAR, so I'm with you, Yuki, and I think it's the time to talk about those things. You could just take one aspect of VAR and it could just talk about forever. But I totally agree that those are really important points. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Marion, and thank you, Yuki, for your question. Okay, let's thank Marion one more time.